All his life long he had hated mittens, beginning with his earliest childhood, when they had hung his mittens on a yard-long cord around his neck. Oh, how he hated them! It's always mittens, mittens, mittens with her, Conrad is supposed to have said to Fro. No matter that I am concentrating on the urban chick method, concentrating on my book, on making a little headway with the method and the writing, she has nothing in her head but mittens. Mittens she is knitting for me, even though I loathe mittens. Imagine, my dear Fro, Conrad said, except for my earliest childhood, I have never worn mittens in my life. I have tried telling her, I often said, but I never wear mittens. Why do you have this mania about knitting mittens for me? I shall never wear them, and yet here you are knitting away at them. He is supposed to have told her, just as she had formerly spent decades sewing nightgowns for the poor and for orphans, Conrad is supposed to have said to Fro, these last few years she had taken to knitting mittens, not, that is, hundreds of pairs of mittens, but only the one pair of mittens, always the same pair, for her own husband. She knits them and unravels them, and re-knits them and unravels them. She knits dark green mittens and bright green mittens, a pair of white mittens, a pair of black mittens, knits them and then unravels them again, Conrad said to Fro. She made him try on the same mitten hundreds of times. That terrible business of having to slip into the mitten every time, he is supposed to have said, with her knitting needles dangling from her half-finished mitten as he tried it on. An excerpt there from the last third of Thomas Bernhard's The Lime Works. This was originally published in 1970, Das Kalkwerk, and then the English translation came shortly after in 1973 by Sophie Wilkins. Many of you will know or remember that I adore Bernhard. He, I think more so than McCarthy these days. Thomas Bernhard is my old friend. And, if I wanted to, I would just, I think maybe in time, I will review every one of Bernhard's works, really. But the time has come in a way for me to do a review of my favorite Thomas Bernhard, which is this. It's The Lime Works. And it is such a strange, complex, claustrophobic, surreal, funny, grotesque, and honestly insane novel in form, in style, in content, in purpose. Everything about it screams insanity. It is on the edge of insanity. If it had gone further one way, you would have locked Thomas Bernhard up. If it had gone further the other way, you'd have said, no, this is just bitter and weird. And yet somehow Bernhard, with his usual maestro ability, the lazy master, manages to tie this whole strange thing together. So what the hell am I talking about? What the hell is this book? So, The Lime Works, Das Kalkwerk, is about, we really have two characters. Well, we have three characters again. We have Conrad, who is an obsessive intellectual who is working in the realm of hearing. He's researching hearing, and he is doing auditory experiments, which I'll get to. But he is obsessed with it. He is neurotic about it. He is the definition of obsessed about hearing and what it is to hear correctly and not being disturbed, and noise, and with that silence. And via this obsession, to write his book, his magnum opus, he has isolated himself in a decaying lime works in rural Austria. And I will get to some excerpts about the lime works next. The other character is Fro, his wife, and she is disabled. She's in a wheelchair. She is in constant pain, it seems. She is sort of becoming paranoid about what in the world Conrad is even doing. It seems that before they moved to the limeworks, they actually had a very expansive, socialized life. And so now she has been brought in this crippled state to basically become, in her wheelchair, the victim of Conrad, who is performing obsessive experiments on her. That one of the questions maybe you can ask about the book is whether or not his experiments and his method and his whole purpose has any point altogether, which is all about oral, as in auditory discrimination, repeating words and vowels and sounds to her over and over and over again in one ear, and questioning her about the phonetics of certain words and going through various phonetics with her. And she becomes one of his obsessive victims. But, of course, in typical Bernhard style, he spoils his own book within the first page, because what we find is that the story opens with Fro's brains being scattered across the floor of the limeworks, with Conrad being found half frozen under a big pile of manure nearby. So he's blown his wife's brains out, basically. And the story then, the novel unfolds sort of in reverse. And I guess in a sense, we're given this idea of like, are we going to try figure out what happened? But of course, this is Bernhard. This is Thomas Bernhard, who in The Loser would say, look, this guy dies, this guy kills himself, this guy gives up, right? This you're already on the back foot because it's Thomas Bernhard. So the novel then is piecing together the final years of Conrad and his wife, and what exactly happened, what led to this moment of him blowing her brains out with a rifle that was always strapped to her chair. Now, that in itself is a complicated, complex, tricky plot. But of course, anyone who knows Thomas Bernhard will know that his style is, and this is earlier Bernhard, where he's being, I would argue, more courageous, especially with the surreal aspects, as you probably already noted. It's very surreal. The whole plot of it is very surreal. But he's also being the most bombastic, the most sort of courageous he ever is, I think, with this novel, which is why I love it so much. His cynicism and anger and outrage towards Austria, towards doctors, towards societal etiquette, finds a subtler and yet stranger voice. It's not as brash as it usually is, but of course there is all the typical Bernhardian outrage in there as well, against, about money, about Austrian society, about doctors especially, which I'll get to. But in terms of style, of course we have this one unbroken paragraph throughout the whole book, as is typical with Thomas Bernhard. Not only the originator of that style, but unsurpassed. As far as I'm concerned, he is completely unsurpassed. The Krasner Hawkeye there is a massive list of authors who very few people have yet to really just acknowledge. Look, there is a huge John Foss, Krasner Hawkeye, Sebald, and a whole smorgasbord of Austrian writers are all so heavily indebted to Thomas Bernhard, and yet no one even mentions this. And not only are they are in Bernhard's debt, none of them surpass him. none of them really do anything that even comes close to what Bernhard himself did with the style that he originated, that he developed, that he kind of founded as this great rupture in literature. But anyway, back to when we're piecing this together, it's Bernhard, as I've said. Everything is hearsay. Everything about what may or may not have happened is fragmentation, either from Conrad was supposed to have said, is the typical line of the novel. Conrad is supposed to have said, like as if he's relaying it to us. But it's also secondhand reports and rumors and observations from locals and acquaintances. And so basically, we're left with this absolutely chaotic seeming mess of communication. Now, what is the one thing, as is the case, I think, with all Bernhard novels, and I've read every single thing the man has written now, including like the plays and some of the more obscure stuff. I've read everything Bernhard has written, and I've said to multiple people who've slowly become interested in him, and it's the question that fascinates me, but I think I do have an answer. Bernhard typically does the same thing every time, okay? So he spoils the book immediately. So like if you're trying to sell a book to someone, imagine this, right? This for me is the question, which is, this is the things Bernhard typically does. He spoils the book immediately. He tells you exactly what's happened. Conrad has killed his wife. And they lived in the Slimeworks, and he kind of went mad. The typical story would be someone goes mad, and then you get, oh my god, is he going to do it? What's going to happen? He does this typically with so many of his books. Woodcutters, The Loser, and Limeworks are three great examples where anything like traditional plot there isn't a plot because it's already been spoiled. He is unfathomably repetitive. Bernhard will say the same thing for 2 pages in different ways. Okay? So the book is spoiled, the plot is spoiled, it's extremely repetitive. His language use, it really isn't that extensive. It's often very basic vocabulary. The topics usually don't veer towards a pessimistic sort of actual investigation, nor anything that's trying to get beyond into, say, like go beyond misery into joy. He stays with the sort of the kitchen sink of Austrian petite bourgeois sensibilities, and just has this cynical, bitter outrage towards them that doesn't typically have any really low lows or really high highs. You don't really get many cathartic moments. You equally don't get many moments, any moments that of like, right, finally it's going to explode, are usually usurped already, right? So this book could have really built up a tension that could have gone somewhere, but of course it's already... Bernhard doesn't allow you anything like that. Any balloon, there's no possibility for a balloon to sort of be blown up. You know, he's not interested in that. So all these factors, this book is, the book has really no plot. It's repetitive. The language is fairly simple, and it's very miserable, right? This is not a selling point. And so the question for me, why I've become so fascinated with Bernhard, and why I love Bernhard so much, is... what is it? Why does it? How the hell does this work? Why am I absolutely enraptured, just completely captivated by this? And it's because you're reading music. Bernhard, when he was younger, was this is very rough, but he was when he's very, very young, he loved singing, operatic singing, I believe, but because of conditions with his lungs, couldn't go forward as a career into that. And so I see, sort of tragically, Bernhard's novels are his continuation of music. You're just listening to music, and you are listening to literary music that manages to be so beautiful that it can hold together a story, a tale of an obsessive, neurotic intellectual who is torturing his wife via auditory experiments whispering them to her over and over and over again in her ear from within this horrific, claustrophobic limeworks. And why would you ever want to spend time here if there wasn't? And it's because you're just listening to music. But that's why. But I will give you our other character, which is the limeworks. This reality was made manifest, to begin with, by the barred windows he had installed in those thick walls immediately after acquiring ownership. Functional iron bars, as Conrad put it. I ripped out the ornamental ironwork and installed functional iron bars. He has been quoted as saying, "Those thick walls and the iron bars sunk into them instantly show that this is a prison." The ornamental wrought iron with which the limeworks has been decorated before Conrad's time, relics of 2 centuries of poor taste, were removed at Conrad's orders. We said to Weiser. They all had to go at once. He had torn most of them out of and off the walls with his own hands. He broke them off, knocked them off, broke them down, knocked them down, tore them down, ripped them down, and never replaced a single one of these knocked down and broken up and ripped off squiggles with any new squiggles. The limeworks were now totally bare of ornamentation. Conrad is reported to have told Fro even the path leading up to the limeworks, though in fact there was only a single stony path leading up to the limeworks, as anyone could see at once, had been loosely paved with coarse gravel. Everything was simplified. He aimed to restore the limeworks to their original condition, regardless of what anyone thought. To continue, just to skip forward a bit. To Fro, bare walls, functionalism, strategy for self-inquiry, catastrophic economy. To Weiser, firmly locked, firmly bolted doors, closely barred windows, everything locked up, bolted, barred. Do you realize that the limeworks doors used to be fastened by simple latches? Conrad is supposed to have cried. Imagine, simple latches. Nowadays the doors are all secured by heavy bolts of dressed timber set deep in the walls. Set deep into those thick walls, Conrad is said to have told Weiser. Bolts that have to be pushed in or pulled out by force. What with the constant humidity here, it was of course always necessary to use a good deal of force. The security factor was the most important one by far. First of all, Conrad had said to his wife, according to Weiser, they had to secure themselves against intrusion from the outside world, from which they had at last succeeded in escaping. So all the windows had to be barred at once, and all the doors had to be bolted, and that was what in fact they did. Right after moving in, Conrad told Weiser. The very day after paying an unheard of, actually an incredibly high purchase price for the limeworks, the Conrads moved in and instantly had all the windows barred and all the doors bolted. They had bolts attached even to the inside doors, heavy bolts and heavy bars on the windows. In fact, the blacksmith at first refused to make bars that heavy, Conrad said, but he finally gave in because Conrad would not yield an inch, and also promised to pay quite a lot. So the whole chapter there is a repetition, but of the limeworks, and this is why Conrad has moved there, is to slowly have a place. He is the embodiment of him and the limeworks as a duo are the embodiment of creative paralysis and perfectionism. He has one other thread running throughout this is Conrad's inability to write his book. He always has an idea. He is completely paralyzed. He is the perfectionist who has the idea for his magnum opus of auditory experiments to write down his sort of philosophy of sound that he's going to write down. But he never really gets around to it. He is paralyzed, and so he's trying to put himself within the perfect conditions. He's been accumulating notes and conducting experiments, but the act of writing, he always has excuses. Sound and noise is always deterring him and deferring him from this, and so the conditions themselves become his sort of excuse, but at the same time he has moved the very place that he's in, that this claustrophobic limeworks is the very thing that is building up the tension of his inability and his deferral to ever get down what he wants to get down. Now, the limeworks then just becomes a symbol, basically, of paralysis. And his wife, Fro, has been drawn into this. I mean, her being in a wheelchair, being completely paralyzed herself, the, the, the impossibility of anything ever happening in this place, the destructiveness of this, it just unfolds into a hellish tension with this place that was supposed to provide the perfect isolation and silence for work. Basically, from that supposed purity, anything that intrudes, which is his wife's apparent interruptions, the neighbor's noise, inadequate lighting, bad furniture, wrong times of day, basically ends up in this insane factor of self-sabotage, which, as far as I'm concerned, sort of doesn't realize itself, but in a sort of moment of just blunt force, Freudian pressure, we could say, a dream comes to Conrad. This is actually quite later on, but I think it's apt earlier on. Fro incidentally confirms Weiss's story that Conrad dreamed about the murder a long time before he actually did it. It was about a year ago that Conrad told the following dream. Conrad dreamed that he had gotten up in the middle of the night because of an idea that came to him for his book, and that he sat down at his desk and actually began to write it down. And by the time he had written about half of the book down, he felt that he would succeed in getting down all of it. This time that he would get it all down on paper in one sitting. So he kept at it and wrote on until it actually was all down on paper, all complete, finished. Instantly his head dropped down on his desk in total exhaustion, as if he had fainted. But as his head lay there in near coma on his completed manuscript on the desk, he was nevertheless observing himself in his unconscious state, and observing everything else in the room. To sum up the situation, Conrad has been able to get his work down on paper, as he had so often imagined it, for decades on end. He had written it all in one sitting, suddenly, from one moment to the next, as he had always dreamed he would. But now that he has set down the final word on paper, he has fainted dead away, fallen where he is, but observing himself in this unconscious state from every angle of his workroom. It is the ideal moment, the ideal situation of his life, as for hours on end Conrad sees himself lying there unconscious in the full possession of his completed manuscript, having just finished the complete text, and ended by writing on the title page, in his old-fashioned large calligraphic hand, the sense of hearing. His last act before his head dropped like a stone onto the title page he had just written, afterwards seeing himself in this state from every possible angle, seeing the whole scene, which he later described as the happiest of his life, though in fact it is unquestionably the unhappiest, basically, of his life. And then suddenly, abruptly, Conrad is supposed to have told Fro. The door opened and Conrad's wife walked in, this crippled woman chained to her invalid chair all those decades, and who in reality could not have managed to take one single step unaided. In fact, she could not even have pulled herself upright in her chair unaided. Suddenly is standing there in Conrad's room and comes over to the unconscious Conrad, her husband, who was watching closely the whole time, and bangs her fist down on the manuscript under his head and says, "So, behind my back you have written down your book, have you? Behind my back." A fine thing, she says over and over again. Behind my back, she says, while Conrad watches and hears everything all the time. He is lying there in his coma, with his head on the completed manuscript. Even the shock of his wife's fist banging down on the manuscript right next to his ear hasn't torn him out of his coma. And here comes her fist banging down on the manuscript a second time. Can you imagine? A woman whose energy has been totally drained away long since, after decades of huddling at a paralyzed cripple in her invalid chair, brutally bangs her fist on his manuscript, saying, "That's what you think? That you can sit down here in secret, you sneak, and get your book down on paper, just like that, all in one sitting? Think again." And with that she grabs up the whole pack of manuscript and flings it in one powerful motion into the flaming stove. But of course this is Conrad's dream. Conrad's dream, as far as I'm concerned, is a projection of how he sees the world. Conrad doesn't start anything, because if he starts anything, in typical sort of Austrian and Bernhardian perfectionist fashion, well, if you start anything, then it may very well become a failure. And I think this is one of the reasons that a lot of Bernhard's books, and I think he would also be the first to coyly admit this, one of the reasons that Bernhard's books And novels and style doesn't go anywhere, because if it went anywhere, it could fail. And it's a comment itself on the success and ambition and bourgeois, again repeating myself, success culture of Austria, that Bernhard wanted to avoid that. So you never get anywhere. You're always going back and back, around and around and around. As you can see with these excerpts that I'm reading out as well, the novel is doubly complex, because we're always, anytime we get a single sentence, it's Weiser, Conrad told Weiser apparently from Fro, or Fro told Conrad who told Weiser. So it's a novel about communication. It is a novel about hearing, and as per the title of Conrad's own magnum opus, the sense of hearing. Well, what are we hearing? Who are we hearing this from? What the hell is this story? Why do I care? Why do I care about this basically neurotic obsession to just try figure out maybe why this guy blew his wife's brains out? So it's like a murder mystery told from the point of view of the murder, the act of murder. Like no one gets out of anything. And basically, the reason I think this is Bernhard's greatest, on par with Gathering Evidence, but Gathering Evidence has his biography is much more straightforward, but that's in a realm of its own. The reason I think this is his magnum opus, and some of you might have already cottoned onto this as per why I read the Mittens section to start, is that it's a novel about the prison of human consciousness. We could say the prison of Conrad's hyper-awareness, his neuroticism, his intellectualism, his inability to ever get liberated, his endless circular thinking, which is typical Bernhardian trait as well. He's imprisoned with obsessions and resentments and a constant noise that goes throughout the novel, and this like double backing of every single term and every single word. Every single thing is doubted at least once, and it's basically a self-consciousness that does not stop recurring. The reason I think this is his just a triumphant work is because this book is that. You get put into insanity for 200 and so pages, and you have to do you have to do the auditory experiments. Whether it's reading about Mittens, whether it's repeating something in your mind, whether it's reading the fucking word Conrad 20 times on a page, Conrad, Fro, Weiser, Conrad is supposed to have said, "I am going insane, Thomas. I am going insane, and you've made me care." But at the same time, this is back to what I was saying about why the hell this works. No one else can pull this off. It's because you are in the midst of, I don't know, Ride of the Valkyries or something. You are completely drawn along by this beautiful, beautiful music. And without that, it's nothing. Without that, it would be embarrassing, even. So let's move a little bit to the hearing and the method, and then we can sort of look into also what I mean by the fact the book is also that. Fro reports Conrad saying to him as follows: when he, Conrad, was in his room working on his book, he could hear his wife breathing upstairs in her room. Believe it or not, it was a fact. Of course, his wife's breathing in her room, one flight up from his, was not normally audible in his room. He had tested it out time and again. Nevertheless, he did, in fact, hear his wife breathing in her room while he was in his room. But of course he, Conrad, was chronically in a state of the greatest possible attentiveness. He could even hear human voices across the lake, even though it was normally impossible to hear human voices across the lake from the limeworks. This is very early on in the novel. We understand that Conrad's ability to hear may actually be a delusion. There is a lot of delusion in this novel. But then when we move through to his actual method, the Urbanchik method, this is when we begin to question, well, is he an intellectual or is he insane? So there's two excerpts on this, both very fun. Then he commenced his analysis, but after only about 2 hours of such experimentation, she would ask him how much longer it would take. Conrad told Fro, and started complaining about her earache, which was steadily worsening, especially in winter. He would tell her then how long the experiment would take that day, whether it was to be only a brief 3 or 4 hours or a longer 6 or 7 hours. In any case, his experiments in accordance with the Urbanchik method were important to him, and he had let not a day pass without experimentation. He might say, for instance, "How long is it now since I've experimented with the short I sound?" Or, "How long since we've worked on the short O, or the short R, or the short U?" He would alternate, for instance, between reciting the sentence, in the inn district it is still dim, into her left ear, then into her right ear, then moving from one ear to the other and back again. In 1 hour of such work he might produce about 2 pages of notes, but usually he destroyed those notes right away, so that no one could deduce his method from his notes. In the midst of an exercise he might, for instance, suddenly say to his wife, "You must distinguish between the hard and the soft I." She understood perfectly, and yet she did it all wrong, time and again. So the effort had to be redoubled, which meant that the discouragement some days was also redoubled. If she did not follow the rules, he would tell her the exercise was a waste of time. Sometimes it took as long as half an hour for her to catch on to the simplest point. Naturally, it was all far too demanding, especially everything connected with the Urbanchik method, far beyond her strength, he would think. But nevertheless, he went on repeating the exercises prescribed for each experiment without a pause until she actually collapsed. So that's one, and then I'll go through to the second excerpt on the Urbanchik method. Standing in the east corner of her room, he would plan to call out to her words with the U sound: Urals, Uremia, Uranus, Usual, Union, Uruguay, Usury, Utopia, etc., etc. This would be followed by words with O: Oklahoma, Odious, Ore, Oil, Open, etc. Then words with K: Cast, Card, Khartoum, Carefree, Catastrophe, Catafalque, Kabbalah, Kabul, Catharsis, Cataracts. Then words with S: Ether, Estragon, Escudos, España, Eskimo. Then words with Al: Albania, Alba, Alcon, Alhambra, Algebra, Alkaloid, Almira, Arms, etc. Then words with Istria, Ismail, Istanbul, Islam, etc. Getting out of bed, he would be thinking that he could start the exercises during breakfast, so as to include the conversation or the silence at breakfast in the exercises. He would talk about the difference between listening and hearing, starting with an explanation of listening, then of hearing, giving ear, hearkening, pricking up one's ears, auscultation, overhearing, jointly hearing, etc. Listening in, mishearing, lending an ear. Then suddenly he would say to her, trying not to hear. Listening hard, he would say. He had prepared their breakfast the previous evening, so that he merely needed to carry their tray into her room in the morning. They had always breakfasted together in this way since the first day they were living together. While carrying the tray up to her room, he usually had the most brilliant ideas for his book on the use of the Urbanchik method. There's 2 examples of the actual method, the actual purpose of him moving here, the purpose of what he's doing altogether. Those are the 2. I mean, we're given a few others throughout the novel, but in Bernhard's fashion, I think what we do lean into the reality of the character, and this is a character maybe like an early Freudian who is actually very protective of their methods. So we're just given snippets. We're given fairly expansive snippets, but it's up to us to deduce. It's up to us to deduce the exact same question that we should be asking of Bernhard, which I think is that. The question, is Conrad a madman, is the exact same question we should ask of Bernhard for this book. Is that auditory experiment to just try and get someone to hear something, to hear some music? Am I communicating properly? And for those that don't know, Bernhard's only real philosophical influences are Schopenhauer and Wittgenstein. And of course, Wittgenstein's really his entire life's work of whether or not something can actually be communicated is found in this, and also another novel by Bernhard called Correction, which is his most emphatically Wittgensteinian. But we need to ask that of both. And Bernhard has music on his side. Conrad doesn't really have anything like that on his side. Now, Bernhard also throws in a few other hints that I think border on One of them borders on sadistic because it's quite late on, after we've really been engrossed in the method itself and the story itself. And for me, it's a great hint towards something. I grant you that to be unable to put your finger on the real cause of all our troubles is a torment even to a man with a complete idiot of a wife around his neck. A lifelong torment, if you like. But the real cause can never be found. Whatever cause you think you can spot will turn out to be a fake. All of our contemporary so-called scientific research into what causes what, all of it misapplied because it misunderstood, inevitably comes up with nothing but fake causes, because it is in fact possible to understand the whole world, or what we believe to be the whole world, or what we think we recognize as the world on a day-to-day basis, as a result of nothing but fake causes arrived at by fake research. You could waste decades of your life trying to get better of this self-perpetuating duplicity, but all you would get out of that was to grow old, that was all. To go under, that was all. Suppose you make a statement Conrad is supposed to have said to Freud, only one sentence, say, no matter what it is, and suppose the sentence is a quotation from one of our major writers, or even one of our greatest writers. All you would succeed in doing is to besmirch, to pollute that sentence, simply by failing to exercise the self-control it would take not to pronounce that sentence at all, to say nothing at all. You would be polluting it. And once you start polluting things, the chances are you will see everywhere you look, everywhere you go, nothing but other polluters, a whole world of polluters going into the millions, or more precisely into the billions, is at work everywhere. It is enough to shock a man out of his mind if he will let himself be shocked, but people no longer let themselves be shocked. This is in fact precisely what characterizes the man of today, that he refuses to be shocked by anything at all. So firstly, there's a lean towards, so those are all the excerpts that I want to read. I won't talk to you anymore. But we're left with the impossibility of communication. He experiments on his wife. He doesn't really listen. He doesn't really connect. We never hear directly from Conrad. We never hear directly from his wife. Everything is possibly distorted, possibly fabricated. Basically, the fundamental human connection of his novel is impossible. So it's Wittgensteinian in that sense that we're kind of put within, quite literally within, an architecturally Wittgensteinian space, which is the limeworks, which is meant to be functional and perfect, but we become isolated in that world and we just can't communicate. There's an impossibility of communication. But what this leads to is a horrific, and I mean a horrifically maddening pressure, which Bernhard manages to turn into music and makes funny as no one else could. But it's a long, repetitive, spiraling sentence that just mimics Conrad's own obsessions. The constant repetition of Conrad said, or according to Freud, or Conrad is supposed to have said, nothing is direct, everything is filtered. Absolutely every single facet of this novel is unreliable to the point where you no longer even know why you started it, what you cared about, or whether or not the questions that were put there were really put there by you at all. Everything is reasserted, qualified, contradicted constantly. And what is the answer? I mean, what if there can be one? Now, I've lent towards the answer early on, which is that if we were to use someone like Wittgenstein, we don't find, I've read a fair amount of Wittgenstein. There's very little redeemable there for me because we don't find humor in Wittgenstein. Or at least I haven't. So my argument around my position on Bernhard generally and why I think he's a master, but I call him the lazy master, is that in the Schopenhauerian sense, and he is influenced by Schopenhauer, the only break from this life, Bernhard is, he's a miserabilist, he's a pessimistic writer, make no doubt about it. For Schopenhauer, the only break out of this life is the aesthetic experience. a beautiful piece of music, being drawn into a beautiful piece of music. The sort of, being drawn into this is very rough and ready, but being drawn into that platonic form, which is a momentary sort of rupture in time, we could say, and then you come back down for Schopenhauer into the pendulum between boredom and suffering. And boredom and suffering absolutely encapsulate Bernhard's work. But why Bernhard is a master, and this book is there's no greater example than this one, is that Bernhard takes the Schopenhauerian foundation of boredom and suffering, stays exactly with it. He does not add in nostalgic sentimentality. He doesn't add in nostalgia. He doesn't add in sentimental transcendence. He doesn't add in moments of catharsis. He also doesn't go ridiculously, grave and like, oh my God, look how absolutely awful it is. I mean, it could be far worse than this, right? So he stays with that sincerely, and yet transforms that into an aesthetic experience itself. So Bernhard's masterstroke is a lot of imminently usurping the social pessimism of Schopenhauer, which is really the Austrian social pessimism, via sort of, to use like Deleuze's term on Spinoza, sodomizing it, literarily sodomizing it. And it is the ultimate insult, in a way. It's the ultimate insult to Austrian politeness and etiquette, which he hated. His outrage finds its form by way of using that banality, using the suffering, using the boredom, using the banality, and using the neurotic recursivity of Austrian petite bourgeois hypocrisy. He tangles it up in itself and uses it against itself as the only thing that they really care about. So there's something in Austrian society at this time and generally that wants, great plays and wants great art. But Bernhard feels that no one can really see them. I think no one can really see them because they want it to be seen. They want the status. And so he uses that whole framework against itself. And he does the exact same thing in the line works with the position of the artist. But at the same time, he's not arrogant about this. So many people call him a pseudo-intellectual. And I, on the one hand, that's why I call him the lazy master, because I think he's a master. But he would much prefer to be drinking coffee and eating pastries. 100%. I don't, as crass and almost coy as it is to say, I don't think he cares about these works. I'm not sure, but you can't help but if you get the Bernhard bug, you will fall in love with him so deeply. And of course, what's really the resolution of the novel? Death. Death is the resolution. There's no judgments. There's no sentiment. There's absolutely no moral judgment throughout this. The extremes are found in repetition of a flat. Imagine it's a paradox of a flat repetition being repeated so much it becomes an extreme. And that, that's where, to put this in musical terms, it's sort of like Bernhard's experimental classical, right? There's so much just classical form in here in a way. But there's just these notes, almost like a Turner painting of like, boy, what the hell is that? So I won't go on anymore lest I repeat myself, but it is a book to be in awe of. It's one of those books that truly unique, singular. It's a singular book. That's alike every single other one of his. Yeah. Read it somewhere where you're going to be disturbed. Read it on a bus. Read it somewhere noisy. I think I want to dare listeners. I want to dare someone to sit in a room with no distractions and read it straight through, trying to pay as much attention as you can after a bad night's sleep or something. Because you will be drawn into It's a hellish experiment. But boy, it's proof. It's proof that something after World War II could be written that is a rupture again, is new, that stands on its own, that it has an unfathomable courage that isn't macho, that has nothing to do with that. Bernhard would hate that, and it just looks at you with this mischievous grin, and it's just fantastic. That's my thoughts of Bernhard's 1970 Das Kalkwerk, or The Lime Works. And some people have been asking me at the end of these reviews to say, what's the next book I'm going to be reviewing? So I'm going to start doing that, but with a caveat, with a fine to do that. But here's the thing, often and it's happened quite a few times, is that I will read a book and then I will think, yeah, that's good, but I can't really add much or really review it, like do a review that would really say anything. So that happens quite frequently. But with that said, the next book that I'm thinking will probably get a review is Nikos Kazantzakis' Zorba the Greek. So if you want to read that before I did a review, then go ahead. But this is a review for the Limeworks. Go read Bernhard. We need a Bernhard renaissance. Thanks for listening.